Powkiddy V20 is another budget vertical handheld that has entered the market, looking like an original DMG with extra buttons and analog sticks. But can the Powkiddy V20 bring anything new to the world of retro handhelds, or is it just another device which doesn't do much to stand out from the crowd? I've been using the Powkiddy V20 for the past week to answer these questions, and this is what happened. When the Powkiddy V20 first arrived and I opened the box, I had one overwhelming thought. Haven't I already played this device? There was a time when vertical handhelds that looked like the original Gameboy with analog sticks were a pretty unique and new idea. However, the phase we're at with retro handhelds includes so many Gameboy lookalikes now that it's probably the most common looking design. The colours, the layout, everything about the Powkiddy V20 feels familiar, but not in a good way. More in a here we go again kind of way. However, aesthetics are only a part of the story. For me, they're quite a big part of it when it comes to retro handhelds, but the overall gameplay experience is ultimately what matters. And the Powkiddy V20 could pack a lot of potential under those generic looks. So like always, I decided to enter the week with optimism as to what the V20 could offer. Straight off the bat, and things just felt a bit awkward with the V20. Powering it on felt a bit hit and miss. The startup logo would sometimes reappear twice and hang. I wasn't sure if I hadn't put the SD card in properly or if it was in need of a charge. I messed about with the SD card and plugged in the V20 and managed to get things up and running. But this was not the only time this occurred over the week. The amount of times it actually happened was quite frustrating, and it feels like it could have been avoided if things were more clearly communicated in the OS. The OS is often my issue with Powkiddy devices, and it feels like this is going to be more of the same. Regardless, once I got up and running, I jumped straight into some PSP emulation. And this is where the V20 finally started to impress me. The PSP emulation is really solid on the V20. Playing MotoGP was an absolute blast and the V20 handled it with ease. Testing things out and moving over to Dreamcast emulation, and gameplay as expected was nice and smooth. I wanted to spend some time with Metropolis Street Racer and I decided to set my sights on unlocking the Toyota MR2. So I spent my time trying to beat the lap time to unlock it. The V20 handled things really well, however having to use the shoulder buttons for accelerate and brake was a bit awkward, and it did mean it took me longer to achieve that lap time. Moving on to PS1 emulation, and I almost didn't bother testing this as with the PSP and Dreamcast performing so well, you could easily expect that PS1 was going to be a breeze. But I'm glad I did, because that turned out to not be the case. When I first started up Colin McRae 2, things were really choppy. At first, I thought there must be some kind of issue that maybe a restart would fix. But even after multiple restarts on different days and with different games, PS1 emulation seemed to have a serious issue. Now, I don't want to say the V20 struggled, as I know the hardware itself should have no issue with emulation at this level, but there was definitely something wrong. I suspect it's a software issue, and as I said earlier, Powkiddy always seems to have issues with their software. To be totally honest, despite the solid PSP and Dreamcast emulation, I was left so frustrated with the V20 that I really struggled to pick it up and play it throughout the week. It's not that I actively avoided it, it's just that I had no real desire to pick it up and play. I actually spent more of my time reading that week rather than playing games. I have to note also that it was the Easter weekend and we did have a few things going on, including having family over with lots of food, so gaming wasn't top on my priority list. In the end, I decided to extend the challenge beyond a week, as I didn't feel like I'd given the Powkiddy V20 a fully fair chance. Sure, it has its issues, but it also has a bunch of positives. The PSP and Dreamcast emulation is spot on for the price range. The V20 build quality feels solid and gives the impression that it could quite comfortably take a drop or two. Come to think of it, I did knock it off the table counter on the tiled floor in our kitchen by accident, and it was totally fine. Also, having the standard vertical Game Boy style with recessed analog sticks means it's really easy to carry around with you in your pocket. For the final few days, I decided to go back to PSP gaming. I'd been really enjoying MotoGP over the last couple of weeks, and the last few week-long challenges have had MotoGP as a big part of my gaming, but I wanted to switch things up a bit. A game franchise I've wanted to play for quite a while now is Flat Out. Being a huge fan of Destruction Derby and Burnout, Flat Out has always felt like a perfect game for me. But for one reason or another, I've not got around to ever playing it. I'd always planned to play the main console versions first, but I noticed that the PSP version of Flat Out was on the V20, so I decided to give that a go first. And I'm so glad I finally got around to playing it. because this is one of the most fun racing games I've played in ages. It's got such a great handling model. Hurtling around the corners feels challenging and forgiving in just the right amounts to make for a perfect cocktail of exhilarating racing. Even when you crash, it's so much fun because the environments are so interactive. It's the kind of game that when you finish a race, you can't wait to immediately jump into the next one. The Powkiddy V20 is a weird console for me. In writing this episode, I've been able to highlight some of the positives. However, the time I actually spent with the V20 didn't feel quite that great. It was filled with more frustration than pleasure. The PSP emulation is the shining point, but it's not really the best device for it with its 4x3 screen. I really enjoyed Flatout, and the V20 did a solid job of providing a good gameplay experience. However, if I'd bought this as my main or only retro handheld, I'd be really disappointed with the PS1 emulation issues, especially as devices of this style I believe work really well with PS1 gaming. It's well known that Powkiddy are not my favourite retro handheld manufacturers, but I always give them a fair chance and an open mind. In the past, some of their consoles have turned out great and truly impressed me, but not the V20. However, I'm going to be totally fair and not draw a line under the V20, as I believe all of the issues are software based. And with a good operating system upgrade, the Powkiddy V20 could be a huge contender for top budget handheld. At this point, I really think Powkiddy should start investing heavily in their software department, and the last few consoles have had real potential as durable and fun pocket handhelds. However, they seem to consistently be let down by inconsistent software. Fingers crossed Powkiddy start putting some attention towards their software, or at the very least the community can bring together a nice third-party option. If you do want to get your hands on a Powkiddy V20, links are in the description below. But if you want to check out the Powkiddy device that does tick all the boxes for me, then check out this video right here.